So I tell my story.
So yeah, I'm really excited. This is we've been looking at this for their entire. This is kind of a much element of this as far as working
Yeah.
here.
And I know it's going
All yeah.
like this talk work about it and sort of like
So like just
self-made.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
How's it going?
Oh, well. We got a nice. Yes. If you haven't gone out.
Well, I wouldn't have been staff. I would have been, pretty much just like speaking in different events. Because that was my role. I did a lot of events. I did events where I spoke at a school.
Sure.
In the board here, I want to say. How many? Oh, yeah, see, like, usually for us, since we're like in that 60-day window or maybe 90 days, I usually allow by that.
Yeah.
So, because most of the stuff we do long-term recovery wise is mainly, we don't do a lot of, we do some virtual in-house, I mean, in the field, but most of it chaotic because it's so far out. We'll just do everything virtually on that end of it.
Do you have your core?
Each product. I have my information.
Yeah. Somewhere else.
Yes. And then we have a bunch of.
That's fine. So yeah. Yeah, so I'm on thread that I can say no, that's supposed
She was getting, I mean, she fought hard.
you know, right now, I do, so I really need to take all day. Can also be. No, you see, on the other hand, it's the same options are kind of like 91.
So it's.
I'm like, I have to be by the ocean. And then you
Something so.
I mean, we don't cut things down. I mean, I would be taught that. And then also other.
Everyone, we're going to try to start as soon as William comes back, and everybody in the room, everybody in the Zoom room, thank you for your patience. We're going to get started in just a second. I think we're almost ready. All right, why don't we come to order? Thanks, everyone. This is our final panel for the day. This is on systemic advocacy in disasters. I'm Jeff Baker. I am a clinical professor of law here at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law. have the honor of moderating this panel. I started with Professor Sophia Hamilton, our disaster relief clinic in 2017. As I have joked a lot since then, no one ever sets out to be a disaster attorney. The disaster finds us and we become disaster lawyers. And Julie's nodding at me, and we know some of these stories. So thank you for being here. This is our last session late on Friday afternoon. That means you are the stalwarts. You are the most serious. You are the most dedicated to your cause. Everybody else who left, you can take pride that you are still here. And grateful for you, or you really need the CLE, one or the other, but nonetheless, very happy to stick with us today. Dr. Lucy Jones, in our keynote, she mentioned throughout her presentation several instances of successful and perhaps not as successful efforts at public policy advocacy in local, state, and federal government public policy responses through statutes, regulations, and ordinances. And we're going to talk about that process today, about how that really works from these experts and these people who are really experienced in the field. It is incredibly important because this sets the stage for our preparation, our resilience, and our recovery, and especially for those who are most vulnerable. So I'm going to do some quick introductions, not to take too much of their time. And we're going to ask Lauren in just a minute and Cynthia to give us a primer on how to lobby in like 2 or 3 minutes, how this process works, and advocacy for public policy, and then talk about some of the specific bills that they are that they're currently working on. So joining us immediately to my right is Lauren Klein. She is the Director of Advocacy for Legal Aid Association of California. That is the statewide association of legal aid organizations, where she focuses on multiple bills aimed at access to justice and expanding access to justice in California. We're joined by Cynthia Castillo on the end. She is policy advocate for Western Center on Law and Poverty, the oldest and largest legal support center in the state, with the mission of advocating on behalf of Californians who are experiencing poverty through the lens of economic and racial justice. She is on Western Center's housing team, focusing on land use policies, housing production for people with low to no income, landlord-tenant law, homelessness, and fair housing. On the screen, looming above us, the brooding omnipresence in the sky, is Allison Korn, my fellow Southerner. She is counterpart at UCLA School of Law, the Assistant Dean of Experiential Education, where she also runs the Food Law and Policy Clinic at UCLA, which develops and proposes food security legislation and other advocacy in conjunction with the other major research universities, including food security and disasters like DSNAP, and she knows what she's doing. And I just have to say, on a note of personal privilege, I love that two folks with deep Mississippi roots are running clinical programs in Los Angeles. So cheers, friend. And last but not least, William Simonsek, legal technology attorney for Neighborhood Legal Services of LA County, who brought us together. William works with county, city, and state offices to advocate for better protections for disaster survivors through Neighborhood Legal Services Disaster Assistance Project, most recently developing and implementing 2 access to justice initiatives to better serve clients, attorneys, and policymakers in our continuing quest for a more responsive judicial system. That is enough from me. Lauren, would you please talk about this process of policy advocacy in your work?
Yes, absolutely. So before I dive into talking about a little bit about what my organization does in terms of systemic advocacy, Cynthia and I are going to just give you a real quick overview of what lobbying looks like in California. I'll turn it over to you first, Cynthia.
Can you guys hear me without the microphone? They need it for the Zoom. Okay.
All right, so I'll try not to scream in the microphone because I have a very loud voice. Hi, I'm Cynthia Castillo, policy advocate for Western Center on Law and Poverty on the housing team. I think that was when you were saying my intro, I was like, wow, who is that? That's me. No, I'm very excited to be here. And I think before we kind of jump to, I want to preface a little bit more about my organization and the work that we do. So you're like, who is this and why does she know anything about policy? Western Center plays a couple important roles. And obviously, I think up top, our focus is really on anti-poverty work and, trying to uplift and ensure that all Californians have access to health, public benefits and housing in the state. And in our work, we support legal aid services and community-based organizations across the state by giving them some support in terms of the bills and the legislation that is happening in Sacramento. We engage in impact litigation, attempting to change systems through the courts, and engaging in legislative and budget advocacy in Sacramento. So that's my day-to-day work. I'm in Sacramento lobbying, connecting with legislators, making sure that they're hearing from folks that have a sense of what's happening to those who are in poverty in the state. And I think it's sort of sad, but it's critical that there's that representation in Sacramento, because there's a lot of policy work that's happening and essentially not a lot of the voices or people that look like me or other folks in this room doing that advocacy on the day-to-day. And so I also would love to say what our grand vision for housing is, because I think it's important and critical that that what we're pushing for is that, one, where low-income Californians have access to sustainable and affordable housing in the communities of their choosing. We advocate for strong, clear, and enforceable anti-displacement provisions, the preservation of existing housing stock, promote equitable planning and development. And I think I want to highlight this as really critical and important to me and our organization is dismantling structural racism and land use planning. What we know is that there's been decades of policy that have essentially pushed mostly people of color into the margins, and they're unable to afford a home. And all of that is being just impacted by raising housing costs across the state. And so there's a lot of work now. I think California thinks we're really progressive, but how do we dismantle decades of policies that essentially, pushed low-income people into the corner? So I think that is something I really want to raise. Lauren, I'm really glad that we kind of can assist each other. Is anyone familiar with the legislative process in Sacramento? Feels like they're an expert here, or mostly, is this new to most folks?
Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law.
Exactly. That's actually how I got my job. I looked at that first, and they're like, okay, how a bill becomes a law. So the legislature runs in sessions. And so there is 2 years in one legislative session. We are currently on the second half of a legislative session. And so what happens is, if you have an idea, you can come to a legislator, or as an organization, say, we have an idea about how to, assist low-income folks in their housing, ensure that they're protected by something. You would go to that legislator and they would introduce the bill. And there is the Assembly and the Senate. So two sides of the legislature, two sides of the House. And so in January, a couple things happen. You introduce a bill, and also the governor introduces his January budget proposal. So that is sort of the first step about what California is going to be spending their money on. And it's really a statement of their values, right? What do we value? What are we going to be supporting this year? And so the bill gets introduced and goes through a couple of policy hearings. First, it goes through policy hearings. So what is the subject matter? What is policy there? Then it goes to a financial committee, so appropriations. Does it make sense to support this bill? Is it cost too much money for us? And then it would be heard on the floor and passed. And so where we are now in sort of the legislative session is that we are in the point of time where the bills have gone through the first house. If it's the Assembly, it's gone through the policy hearing. We vetted it on the funding. It's gone off and been voted by all the Assembly members. And now it's switched over and going to the Senate. So it's the natural switchover point. And we're seeing the bills that have survived to this point going through the last bit here and starting to go through the new policy, the same process, but in the different house. I speak really quickly, so let me know if you guys have any questions. And secondly, is throughout the budget is the May revise. The governor released his May revise after policy hearings and saying, this is my revision of what I introduced in January. And then the legislature actually voted this week to pass a budget bill. It's under a constitutional deadline. They had to pass it this week in order to get paid, which is like a law that they introduced. And so they passed the budget, which is in just to be pretty frank, it's the preliminary budget. There's still opportunity for changes and tweaks in the next coming months through trailer bill language. Now I'm getting into the weeds, but that's essentially where we are in the legislative session. The bills that we've been working on that have survived at this point are now in the opposite house, and continuing through that point, hopefully to get passed and signed by the governor by September of this year. Lauren, that was a lot.
No, I think that was a great overview. Honestly, that and that Schoolhouse Rock video, and you understand how the legislative process works in California. A couple of things I'd highlight. There's definitely opportunities for systemic advocacy outside of the state legislature. We're going to be talking about the state legislature a lot today, but it's important to remember that's not the only place that policy gets made. A lot of policy is made on the local level and administrative agencies. So keep that in mind, even though we are going to talk a lot about the legislature. And the legislature in California, if you're familiar with Congress and what you read in the news, it's a little bit of a different dynamic here in California. The Democrats control everything, so you don't have that same fight between Democrats and Republicans, though there are certainly different groups. Labor is very powerful in California. That's a factor to consider. There are caucuses in the legislature. Some are more powerful than others. There's a very dynamic and powerful Latino caucus in the California legislature. So these are some things that you'll see in California that you don't see on the national level, but that's kind of the process. I hope that as we all speak today, you'll see that this can be accessible. It can feel mysterious from the outside, but the process was designed so that everybody can be involved. You can talk to your legislators. It's not hard. You can get involved. And I hope that we're able to help you see how you can do that a little bit. So with that, I think I will go to my slides and talk about my organization, LAC, the Legal Aid Association of California, and how we look at systemic disaster response. So the one point that I would want to drive home for you today is that, yes, individuals, we as individuals can help victims of disasters. That's what we do. That's why we're here. But yes, and I'm not getting the clicks. We'll get that working. I'll keep talking. It's not just individuals that are responding to disaster victims. It's also individual organizations. Every organization is its own kind of organism. You need to think about how your organization as a whole can respond in a disaster. And there's a whole legal ecosystem that responds to disaster victims. And I hope that we can think about that whole ecosystem as we think about how to be systemic advocates for disaster response. This is really important for our policy advocacy. Just quickly, my organization, we're a statewide association, so we connect the about 100 legal aid organizations across the state to each other. For all of those organizations, we provide coordination, we provide training, and most relevant for today, we provide advocacy on behalf of the whole legal aid community. What do I say when I say that? What do I mean when I say there's a disaster response ecosystem? I thought it'd be helpful to talk about how I kind of came to this. There was a big earthquake in Napa in 2014. And about that time is also about the time I was coming into the legal aid world, and folks in the Bay Area started to think about planning for disasters. It was the first thing that happened. We formed something called BARC, which was an acronym that I liked, the Bay Area Resilience Collaborative, which has since morphed into a statewide disaster coordinated response entity. But back then we were just BARC. We talked about how to prepare. We made some plans, and then 2017 came and a really intense fire season happened. And pardon my French, that's when shit got real. And we had to take these plans and put them into action and really figure out how to coordinate. And it's been kind of a wild ride since then. We've had really dramatic fire seasons since. And that was the first time we had to figure out what is this ecosystem that's responding to disasters and how is it going to work. So when the fires happened, there's the local legal aid organizations. We made sure they're okay, just like we talked about in the table exercise. We make sure everyone's okay. We make sure they can start to respond. That's what's immediately happening on the ground, but it's more than that. Beyond that, there are other legal aid organizations in the region. When the North Bay fires happened, other organizations in the region, Bay Area Legal Aid, the Justice and Diversity Center helped to set up a hotline. That was something that people outside of the area could do, set up the infrastructure to have a hotline, to have people call in. That was big and important. Then there are support centers. There's legal support centers. There's coordinating entities like my organization. We had to make sure all the people on the ground were talking to each other. Everybody knew what was up. We're recruiting volunteers to help. It's a big undertaking. So those are more entities in this ecosystem. Then very importantly, we had pro bono help. Once we have a hotline set up, we need lawyers to sit there and answer the calls and help people. We need those lawyers to be trained. That was huge in responding to that first big fire season. Our pro bono partners at Morrison and Forrester also created a fantastic handbook for lawyers that are helping disaster victims that has been translated into other languages and updated. We still use it today. Those pro bono partners are a very important part of that ecosystem. Underlying all of that are our justice system partners. There's the State Bar of California that's regulating the practice of law. There's the court system, the Judicial Council. These are all important players in this ecosystem for disaster response. And then there's community-based organizations. People don't always think of lawyers when there's a disaster. That's not the first thing people think that they need. They want to talk to the Red Cross. They're not thinking about going to a lawyer. So partnering with community-based organizations that have community trust is really important. One thing we did was we had local radio stations play ads in partnership with community-based organizations so that people knew to call the hotline, knew that a lawyer could help them. So I hope you can see this really is a whole big ecosystem. We need to not just be thinking about the low-income individuals that are vulnerable and being hit by a disaster, but the whole ecosystem of entities that are serving them. So how do we consider the whole ecosystem as part of our policy advocacy? I would suggest there's 3 ways. We can strengthen the system itself, we can help the helpers, and then we can think outside the box. In terms of strengthening the system, we can do that in a very concrete way, which is by getting more money for legal aid. That's a big part of my job, advocating at the legislature as part of the budget process to get more money on the ground to the organizations that are serving people. That's very important. But there's also kind of more abstract ways that we can strengthen the system. We can work for more diversity in our profession. We can make our organizations look more like the communities that they serve so that we can reach people better. We can create better laws and policies around access to justice issues and the delivery of legal services. In that way, the system is stronger and better prepared in the event of a disaster. The next thing we can do is we can help the helpers. You all are the helpers. You're the people that are serving those that are affected by disasters. We can help you all by empowering you to be policy advocates and not just direct services helpers. This is a big part of what my organization does. We want to help you be policy advocates too. Like I said, this is accessible. It's something you can do. These are a few ways that my organization does this. Every year we have a legal aid day in Sacramento. Anybody from any legal aid that wants to come to Sacramento and meet with their legislator, we will set up the meeting for you. We will create materials. We'll make sure you're comfortable and you know what to do. We've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years, and legal aid has developed a presence. Legislators know who we are. They understand better what we do. And that's what helps us do things like pass better laws and get more funding for legal aid. We can also help you do what we call days in the district, meeting with your legislators in their district offices. We provide technical assistance for that. You want to meet with your legislator? Call me. I will help you figure out how to do it. I'll get you that meeting. I'll tell you what those legislators want to hear. It's really something that can be a beneficial relationship for your policy advocacy. We also do a constituent services project at my organization. We make sure that the constituent services staff in a legislator's office knows who legal aid is and knows what you do so that that connection can be made more easily. I think another way to help the helpers is to listen to what they need. So I'm here to listen to all of you. I don't know what kind of policies need to be passed without asking the boots on the ground, what's happening, what are you seeing, what are the problems? That's really important that the boots on the ground are communicating with the policy advocates. Another way that I can listen to what is needed is to look at available data. We're all collecting data. Every legal aid organization is doing it. Maybe not specifically about disasters. Maybe we are. If we're not, we can be. These are conversations we had early on in our coordinated disaster response years of, wait a second, when fire season happened last year, how many people did we see? How much did demand go up? How long did people continue to need services? We were fortunate in that we could look to other parts of the country where maybe they didn't have fires like we had, but they had hurricanes. And we could look at what is the tail of legal issues that follow people in a year? What legal problems are people going to be having? What are we going to need to be prepared to serve? So taking the predictive value of that data and trying to learn lessons from what has happened and carry them forward is really important. And then lastly, I would just encourage you to think outside the box in trying to do policy advocacy as a whole ecosystem. There's a lot of ways you can do that. One being, what is a disaster? What are we calling a disaster? 5 years ago, I don't know if we were even thinking about climate change as a natural disaster that we need to address, but that is, of course, something that we're doing in our policy advocacy now. When COVID happened, the fire group kind of got together and said, this seems like a disaster. We really are good at doing fire response, but let's employ some of those plans to respond to this very different kind of a disaster. So you can think out of the box that way. You also need to think about what is hot right now. What are legislators interested in? What do they want to do? I think sometimes as advocates, we want to be that zealous advocate. We want to say, hey, this is what I need you to do for my community. This is what I need you to do for my client. But sometimes it behooves you to think about what the policymaker needs and wants. If your legislator really wants to move the needle on homelessness, then you can tell them about how natural disasters have decimated affordable housing supply, how natural disasters make people homeless. My philosophy is always, if you can, say, let me help you do what you want, and together we can both get what we want. We can both help the people that we want to help. A couple other specific examples of how to think outside the box. One is VOCA funding. VOCA stands for Victims of Crime Act. It's a federal source of funding, and around about the time that all of these fires started popping up, there was a ton of this money coming to California. So something that we did was we looked at the intersection between crime victims and natural disasters. And incidentally, the state agency that administers Victims of Crime Act funds is the Office of Emergency Services. So it's also the agency that responds to natural disasters. So we made them see, look at all of the crime victims that you see in the wake of a disaster. There are price fixing rules in place that get violated that isn't necessarily being enforced. There's construction and contractor fraud that happens. There are labor laws that are violated in the wake of disasters. So we said, hey, this is not what you think of traditionally for victims of crime money, but use this money to serve victims of a disaster. So that was one out of the box thing that we did. Another is something called Free Legal Answers, which you may be familiar with. It's basically an online platform where people can submit their legal questions, and then pro bono attorneys can use the online platform to respond. This was created somewhere in the South, I think. And for years, they've been saying, California, you should adopt this. You should set it up. All these states in the South do it. And for years, we've been saying, we can't, we're too big. It's too big. We can't do a statewide portal like that. But when disasters came along and we realized this urgent need for response due to the creative thinking and bravery of people like Tila Chalmers, we went back to the Free Legal Answer folks and said, hey, maybe we can do this specifically to respond to all the legal issues that are popping up in the wake of a disaster. So little things like this, ways to think outside the box. But yeah, I hope that this makes you see that policy advocacy, especially as a whole ecosystem together, can be accessible. There's a lot of ways to do it. And my organization is definitely here to help if you want to get involved.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to bring in Allison. If you'll unmute yourself, you're on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and really wish that I could be there with you all today and be in person, but this is the next best thing, and one of the few silver linings of the pandemic is becoming Zoom fluent. So thank you so much for bearing with me. As Jeff mentioned before, I'm Allison Korn. I lead the Food Law and Policy Clinic at UCLA School of Law. Which I've been very deliberate in being expansive about what the definition of food law and policy means, really kind of thinking about it as a framework where food as just a subject matter brings folks in, but then we're able to sort of come together and discuss and maybe even find some common ground on more polarizing issues, immigration, labor, criminal justice, and so forth. So I'm purposeful in the mission to use what we call integrated advocacy to teach students how to be well-rounded, how to be multidimensional, and in particular, how to pursue community lawyering opportunities. I cut my teeth in disaster lawyering when I was a law student when Hurricane Katrina struck, and I was in Mississippi at the time, and helped, with a variety of other folks organize a lot of student trips to the Gulf Coast. And over time, we began by doing what disaster legal services lawyers do. We responded to the immediate legal needs. And then over time, I watched as my peers, all of us who were pretty young, 1Ls, 2Ls, 3Ls, the scales sort of fell from our eyes a bit, and we began identifying all of these different structural forces that were actually exacerbating these legal issues that weren't necessarily happening because of the disaster, but were made worse because of the disaster. And started thinking about, later on when I was setting up my own clinic and becoming a lawyer myself, I thought about what does the world need to look like in order for disaster response to truly be successful as disaster response? And what can we as lawyers and advocates do to get to that place? So in my clinic, I design projects that try and pair opportunities where students can do traditional policy advocacy, traditional legislative lawyering, but also pursue other creative forms of advocacy. And this includes accompanying movements or working with organizers. And among our goals is to, being part of a law school, being part of an institution, really use our rare and precious institutional resources to achieve maximum positive impact, to go beyond the individual to the collective. But also, and this really, I think, aligns with Lauren's presentation, our aim is to build capacity among legal communities and across mutual aid, across community groups. We try and also connect across law clinics at UCLA so that we can approach these wicked problems, these structural problems, from multiple perspectives. So last academic year, my colleagues in the California Environmental Legislation and Policy Clinic, they often work with different assembly member and state senators' offices to kind of look at proposed draft legislation around environmental law and justice issues. Last academic year, they began the fall working with Assembly Member Eduardo Garcia to research and draft a bill, which became AB 2243. That purported to address the increasingly deadly high and ultra heat conditions for outdoor workers, as well as poor air quality. Specifically, this bill would enhance some of the protections that already exist: cool water, more frequent paid breaks, shade structures, and the like. And so, as we all know, those of us who kind of work in policy advocacy, legislation doesn't begin and end in a single semester. It doesn't have a neat sort of, beginning path and end point in 13 weeks. And so in the spring semester, my clinic took the baton, and students continued to work with the assembly member. And although the legislation had been drafted and presented, my students drafted fact sheets. They identified potential amendments to the bill. But this was really important. We decided that it wasn't enough for students to pursue that traditional policy advocacy, that traditional legislative lawyering on their own. They actually needed to engage with those for whom this policy would be most impactful. We partnered with collectives of farm worker women, including Llederas Campesinas and Alianzas de Campesinas, among others. And we participated in food distributions at first and just listening sessions about whether and how the bill, as drafted, if passed, would actually have its intended impact. And we were able to build these partnerships in part because of our mutual aid collaborations in Los Angeles with a group called Polo's Pantry and its founder, Melissa Asadera, who helped coordinate and supply these food distributions in the Coachella Valley and Oxnard and Taft and the surrounding region. And it was really only by doing the work with and alongside farmers in the Coachella Valley and in Oxnard that students were able to fully understand the possibilities of this legislation, but also the very real limitations of the law, and how necessary it is to, again, kind of referring back to Lauren, be creative and to, work with and within communities that have long been disenfranchised and long been exploited. And this is the only way that we're able to actually achieve change and really try and get to a place again where those acute disaster responses are able to have the impacts that they should. And so I want to just kind of very briefly identify a couple of notable outcomes from this model, beyond just the fact sheets, beyond the listening sessions. One important piece of this was we were able to broker a meeting between farm worker organizers in the Coachella Valley and in Oxnard with the Assembly Members Office and their staff to share feedback from the farm workers themselves, their lived experiences of what it meant to do labor in ultra high heat, to wear PPE in terrible air quality conditions, to grapple with both of those things at one time. What we tried to do was open up these communication lines between farm workers and between electeds so that there need not always be third parties, particularly lawyers, who are involved to share information. We really saw firsthand the power of a power redistribution, and we're keeping those communication lines alive. We also were able to leverage media attention on the Coachella Festival to build a social media campaign regarding the impacts of ultra high heat and poor air quality on farm workers, to sort of, bring this issue out of the shadows to an audience that otherwise see Coachella as a festival and not a place. Our social media campaign was actually picked up by LAist and some other, local journalists. And what was really, I think, critical and was important to me just as a professor was that my students were approached by these journalists to comment on the social media campaign that they had created. And students instead connected them with the farm worker organizers to tell their stories directly. And the stories that followed actually were about the farm worker experiences themselves and could be used to kind of, leverage awareness and support around these very important policies. So the status of AB 2243, is unclear at this time. It is out of the Assembly. It is with the Senate. It goes to the Senate Labor Committee on June 22nd, and we're going to, hope for the best outcome. But in this kind of true consistency fashion of collaboration and bringing together multiple groups to address this problem, the California Environmental Legislation Clinic is once again going to pick back up this baton and kind of take what we have, done with our different integrated advocacy strategies and move it forward in the fall, regardless of what the outcome is. We'll continue to keep working. So this is a model, again, that was born out of my experience as a lawyer, or excuse me, even as a law student. But really, what I took away from that model, again, was less, I don't know today how to file a quit claim, even though I imagine I probably helped file dozens and dozens as a law student. But what I do remember is the importance of community, the importance of solidarity, and the importance of kind of thinking beyond the confines of the law to those who are experts on the ground, how they're living through the experiences, what policies and how policies might impact them, and to really consider that when we are, trying to affect change in this place and come back to a point where disaster relief is in fact disaster relief and not, a David and Goliath situation where we're trying to kind of dismantle these structural forces that have been in place for so long.
Cool. Thank you, Allison. Cynthia, why don't you, I'm just going in the order that you gave me, William. I'm not trying to cut you out, but you gave us this thing. So Cynthia, why don't you tell us about your project?
Yeah. Also, if you'll give me the chance, I kind of want to take a step back. And I think, this panel is called disaster response, but I think there's a context to this, which is there's a climate crisis in California, right? So California faces 5 major hazards as a result of climate change: higher average temperatures and periods of extreme heat, more frequent and intense droughts, increased risk of floods, severe wildfires, and coastal flooding and erosion. So obviously there is 5 impacts to California that are will actually take a lot of different approaches. And I just want to mention this, that the Legislative Analyst Office, which is the LAO, it's a statewide budget a forecasting organization. They work for the legislature. They're typically really conservative, and they released a 6-part report on the impacts of climate change. And they found, really, really scary stuff, right? But this is why we're here and why we're in the game and why we're working with communities to kind of have a sea change maybe about these issues. So wildfires, heats, and floods will force more frequent school closures, disrupting education, childcare, and availability of free school lunches. The state has already approved free school lunches for all. this is what's happening before COVID. We already were closing schools. I mean, I don't have to, sometimes I go to other places and I'm like, we've all experienced this. We've experienced these school closures or individuals can't find childcare. This is impacting low income individuals in the state at a high rate. Workers in outdoor industries like agriculture, construction, forestry, and recreation, 10% of California's workforce, which are mostly made of Latinos, are dying and taking the brunt of extreme heat and smoke. This is happening right now. Wildfire smoke may have killed about 20 people among every 100,000 older Californians in 2020. That was a couple years ago. Housing, rail lines, bridges, ports, power plants, freeways, and other structures are vulnerable to rising seas and tides. And so I'm just highlighting some of the points in this recent report. So there is absolutely a need for all of us to get in the game and realize that climate change is leading to more frequent disasters. And that's why I'm really excited. I just want to make that point before I dive into one of the policies that I'm pursuing and why there's so much work that's happening across the state is because we're seeing this happen more frequently. And I think Californians know this because we experience it. I work in Sacramento and I can tell you for the last 4 years, I expect wildfire smoke in October. I expect it now. Before then, wildfire smoke outside, closing the windows. Now everyone has like a air purifier in their home. So I think we're all realizing that this is going to continue to happen across the state. Toning in on one bill that we're pursuing is called AB 2597 by Assemblymember Bloom. And this is related to one of the issues that I highlighted, which is extreme heat. And I like to liken extreme heat as to a silent killer. It's been something that's been occurring, but it's not, you know, a wildfire that just occurs and maybe decimates a city. It's slowly happening year after year where we're seeing more extreme heat. And so what we thought is, you know, one of the places that's extremely vulnerable to extreme heat is there's two places where you spend your time, the workplace, right? And then your home, your very own home. So how are individuals, low-income folks protected from extreme heat? And we're proud to be a part of a coalition, right? So it's tenant advocates, public health, environmental justice, and linking arms and saying that the standards for what is habitable in the state, what is habitable for our rental units are not enough to protect individuals from extreme heat. So California's habitability laws have addressed public health and safety requirements for rental housing. And for a long time, have always had a requirement that your rental unit be able to have some form of heating. But there is no corollary, there is no other safety for extreme heat. And so what that means is that your rental unit can get up to 105 and it is completely under the eyes of the law habitable. It's still a habitable home. So the LA Times, and many of you may have read this expose, found that California was extremely undercounting heat-related illness and death. And so tenant right advocates said, let's get together and introduce a bill that says that a unit is not habitable if it can't maintain an indoor ambient temperature. That to us is just the first step. What is habitable in California? And, you know, I think I'm remiss to say this because it's sort of beating a dead horse, but I think it's very important, is that low-income Californians, people of color, farm workers, those with disabilities, low-income communities of color are bearing the brunt of this crisis. They are the ones that are dealing with substandard housing across the state. And if you have more money, you are more likely to have air conditioning, you're more likely to have shade, you're more likely to have open space, green space. And so what we have very clearly in these communities is a difference between racial and economic lines. If you are poor in California, you're more likely to have to deal, right, with the extreme heat. And so I think that absolutely should be a critical piece that we need to undertake with 2597. And so I'll just kind of try to lower or sort of kind of get to the point here about 2597 is that as it's going to the Senate housing this week, and we continue to work and pursue this, but we need to all be thinking about how our infrastructure, our housing infrastructure, are we prepared? Are we ready for these, you know, more frequent occurring natural disasters? And I hope folks can kind of help us out and sort of join our effort in trying to ensure that our rental stock can withstand a lot of these natural disasters as we move forward. I'll say a thing in which I think I'm sort of stealing from an advocate from an environmental justice organization that I really, really trust, is that the legislature, and I think Lauren touched on this, we have a Democratic supermajority, so you would think this is a slam dunk, but we've had a lot of issues, right? And the legislature is full of climate delayers, right? California has moved beyond deniers, and we have a lot of Democratic members that are climate delayers. And so I'm here to argue that I think we need to be thinking about how we are more resilient against the climate crisis that is facing all of our communities, and how we ensure, I think, to Allison and Lauren's point, that we're centering the individual, right? The farm worker is at the table. And I'm remiss to say we don't have an organizer on the panel. And I think for next time, we want to make sure that we're hearing from the voices of those who are being impacted by these policies. And really appreciate you all being engaged on this issue, and hope to join with more legal aid organizations to really ensure that we're protecting low-income Californians, people of color across the state. So I'll end it there.
Thank you. Wonderful. William.
Do you hear me? Slides. That's a problem. I won't hold you too long, because I do realize on a Friday afternoon, sitting listening to me is probably not your #1 priority. But I can give a little bit of background as to, this is really more, I suppose, the micro side. I'm surrounded these sides by the people who are really getting the bills together and pushing it. This is more what's going on in the field, is what we do on the legal aid side. There are a variety of reasons why this is true. Part of it is just where our role is historically. There is, of course, the LSC lobbying restrictions, the elephant in the room that I have to address. We only are out to inform, as we're an LSC organization. That said, we have a lot to inform. Our advocates are on the front lines. They're seeing this stuff as it happens. I'm up and ready to go. So I guess you've probably heard a million times say who NLS is, and we're running a bit late. So I'm going to move forward. Other than that, the DAP is a pretty groundbreaking thing, really, the fact that we have a division addressing the disaster issues specifically. Once again, we do multiple levels of advocacy because there's multiple levels of issues, right? For example, I'm looking at Julie Ratroy, who has been very instrumental in some EPA issues in terms of language access. We similarly have issues, state policies. We have issues with local permitting, things like this. Sophia Hamilton in the back, her clinic is very helpful in this regard. This comes out of what we're seeing in terms of the issues on the ground, right? So permitting issues, mobile home issues came out of the Woolsey fire. We are actually we're sitting in the evacuation zone for the Woolsey fire. I'm not sure that's been brought up yet today, but this was a shelter in place location. The hills around us are barren in part because they burnt. This is still, people are still rebuilding in this area. We are still helping clients in this area, and these issues are still arising, but it's not necessarily what people see. People see the thing on the news, they don't see what happens later. So part of what we do is that. The other part that we do, and to link to specifically Cynthia was doing here, we're also in the front lines with extreme heat. We're seeing it hitting our clients first. We're seeing, missed school days. We're seeing health issues coming up. So from my perspective, I'm the policy advocate in this situation. So a lot of why I'm is sending out annoying emails to staff members to get client stories and information on what's going on the ground. I think there's more than a few NLS staff here who probably shudder a little bit when they see my name now. But that's the thing. That's how we find out what's going on. It reveals stuff you wouldn't necessarily know. The education aspect of climate change, extreme heat, for example, is something that we see on the ground. It's not something that immediately comes to mind. And it's also because we're doing this, it's the meta level categorization. Disaster affects everything. And those of you who've been here throughout the day have seen a variety of topics and might get the feeling, oh, this is probably like, how do you keep track of all this? Yeah, it's quite difficult. We are dealing with issues in workers' rights. We're dealing with tenant issues, but we are bringing it all together as a disaster advocate to get help to survivors and address these systemic issues. Funding, of course, is a major issue. And once again, thank you for your efforts and your organization's efforts to secure more of it. Despite the fact that, I believe the United States is has some of the most natural disasters of anywhere. We're sitting in the area, I believe the county in this country with the highest risk rate. Funding is not immediate. You would think that, earthquake, the shakeout event happens tomorrow. We will have, immediately you can set up all these things. No, that's not how it is. In terms of aid for stuff like what we do as advocates, and we're talking potentially 6 months delay. So we're looking to find existing staff bandwidth and move very fast. As I said, even the individual assistance, public assistance, FEMA aid gets delayed. And that's the real visible stuff. Stuff in the background takes longer. The thing is, it's not a fun thing to think about. Point blank, this is a hard thing to keep interest for agencies, elected officials on. It doesn't happen every single day. It does in a certain sense because of extreme heat. And on one hand, climate change is revealing the fact it is revealing these issues. It's also helpful in demonstrating what you can do in terms of mitigation. Because I don't know if we have anyone from FEMA here, but I believe the statistics for $1 of month funding for mitigation, you save $5 in recovery. But people don't want to think about this. I used to do family law prior to disaster law. So to me, this isn't very depressing. But for most of you, you're probably terrified by Lucy Jones's presentation earlier. And I'm pretty sure Kim's exercise didn't help that. So you're not exactly going to spend all day like, well, how can I fix this? Because you don't want to think about it. But the problem is it's going to happen. It takes extra effort. Those of us who are disaster advocacy have to work extra hard because the next new thing comes in. I mean, as Lauren said, there's sort of, gauging the interest of the moment, what issue there is very important for getting these together. Of course, there are issues that are still difficult to resolve. I mean, I will say personally, mobile home issues happen in every disaster. It is one of the hardest issues to get any traction on. It doesn't matter what happens. People are just not interested. They just wait till next time. But by next time, we don't have the protections. We haven't enacted the policies. We haven't managed to do anything about this. So I am less engaged in the state field, but we are quite engaged, city and county, making sure to take these client stories, these issues we're getting from other members of staff and escalate them, inform those who are in charge of what's going on. And in this sense, we have been quite fortunate. There is receptive ears in the city council of Los Angeles. Annoyingly, the news media didn't quite move 4 feet over to see me at the press conference to appoint Chief Heat Officer Segura. But it is actually very groundbreaking that we are having these policies move forward. They are actually doing something to address this at the city and county level. And somewhat of a corollary to AB 2597 that Cynthia is working on, there is a potential for a city residential habitability right to cooling. This exists in Phoenix and Tucson, El Paso, a few other places. Currently, this is all going in the background, maybe not exactly up to speed because it's late on a Friday, but there's a report that came out and they're currently figuring out what the next step of policies are to address this through the new chief heat officer. But aside from the sort of exact particular issues, particular, actions and particular bills, it's the advocacy network. I know Kim discussed this a bit and you as well. It's CBOs, NGOs coming together. Together, we are more powerful getting these issues dealt with. We can see the problems that are happening somewhere else and we can address them ahead of time in another location. We are very fortunate in Southern California to have, I don't know if Joseph is watching, but the Emergency Network of Los Angeles, we have a fairly developed network of nonprofits. And this gives us a collaborative pool for advocacy in addressing these issues. So next steps, hopefully this is all motivating for everybody here to want to get involved because it really does involve all of us. And it does require all of us to get involved. Hopefully we all stay together. We all keep in touch once again, not to scare everybody saying the involvement scare all afternoon, but report came out yesterday saying that we may have to cut our water usage in half in the state because of current water ration levels. Those hillsides are still completely bare. Look at it. There hasn't been enough rain. We are going to have a very bad wildfire season, at least somewhere within the state. Because of that, it's important that we work together, that we are able to address issues as they arise. We keep an open line of communication to those of us who have access to be able to share these stories with people who can do something about it. I put my email address up there. Hopefully, if this is ringing a bell, give me an email.
Great. Thank you all so much. Appreciate you. And this really, it's critical. I have questions. I'm sure other people have questions. I don't know that we have time for them. So I will say one of the most important questions that I would like to ask to any lobbyist is how do you get through the door of your chosen legislature? Now, that may not be for now, but I some grassroots stuff that we might want to talk about, which is how to get the meeting. But you already said that if we need a meeting, just to call you. So thank you for that. Maybe we have time. Skip, Sophia, I'm going to look to you. We have time? Do you want to take about 5 minutes? Okay. So actually answer that question for me. How do you get let's say somebody in here has an idea and maybe hasn't drafted their policy, but they see a problem, how do they get the meeting?
I'm happy to help with that, but I don't think you need my help. It's not hard to do. Call your legislator's office, particularly your own legislator. If you are their constituent, they want to hear from you. You can start with your local office and talk to the folks there that deal with constituents all the time, and they can elevate you to the folks in Sacramento that are trying to come up with new policies. Every office has a scheduler. You can ask to talk to the scheduler. They control the calendar and they can get you a meeting. And I have to say that because of the pandemic, it's become so much easier to do that, particularly to talk to folks in Sacramento. I live in the Bay Area and used to spend a lot of time driving back and forth between the Bay Area and Sacramento. Now it's kind of a thing of the past. Today, in between Dr. Jones's talk and the table exercise, I went out on that patio and I had a meeting with Senator Portantino, who's the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And he was in his car and we talked about a bill, and then I came back to the conference. It's much easier now. But yeah, just call the office, ask to talk to a scheduler. They want to hear from you as a constituent.
Called on email.
Right. And I'll add one thing is the best timing to introduce a bill would probably, if you reach out between the months of October through December. That's sort of the cool down period where we're not working in the legislature, they're in their districts and really trying to get that feedback so that they can introduce something in January. So that's just another timing thing you'd want to keep track of.
Questions from the room? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Yes. From the climate delayer perspective, it just made me think about Dr. Jones's comment on messaging and like getting people to care. And when something is too far off in the distant future in their mind, they just don't care. It's not immediate enough. So how do you incorporate it into your messaging? You know, how do you address the climate delayer in your messaging?
Will you repeat that for everybody on the room?
She was mentioning about the concept about climate delayers. How do we make the right messaging? How do we speak to climate delayers so that they realize that this is something that needs to happen now versus in the long term? And you look so familiar to me. I feel like we've met before, but anyway, we'll connect afterwards. So it's interesting is that, you know, I think the climate change, the mantle of California being a climate change sort of hub really was undertaken by Governor Jerry Brown. Like he made that issue front and center. And Governor Newsom has really tried to step into that space. And so, for example, in my world in housing this year, he actually put money towards this concept, housing as a climate solution. And so I think there are a conversation statewide about how we ensure that that our housing stock is also part and parcel with our climate realities. I don't need the notes anymore anyways. And so to your point, when we talk to people about the need now, I think it's great when you have an impacted individual in your talking points. For example, on 2597, at the hearing, we actually had Agustin, who is a person who from the Central Valley, who spoke directly about how his own home had no way of maintaining any kind of cooling and got up to extreme temperatures, and how in his workday, he was also working in extreme temperatures as a farm worker. And so having him come to Sacramento and saying that this is an issue now was incredibly powerful. And also the caveat is too, he didn't even have heating in his home. And so there are people right now who are also, even with the protections we have in place, don't have the infrastructure to be protected. So I would just want to highlight bringing impacted individuals. And I can tell you, like, the whole room was just like in awe of his advocacy and making time out of his day to come to Sacramento and have that discussion. So I think having impacted people talk about the need now is incredibly important, so that we go from delayer to, like, you know, all hands on deck, let's make the change now.
I would totally agree with that. And I think another helpful strategy in California, particularly on issues that are thought of as, you know, core democratic progressive issues, is to compare California, compare Los Angeles, wherever you are, with somewhere else that's doing it better. We've done that with legal aid funding a lot. When we first were trying to get more legal aid funding, we said, hey, look, here's a list of the states that are spending more money per low-income person on legal services than California is. And Californians don't like to be behind other states, especially less progressive states. So that's definitely a good advocacy strategy as well.
I mean, it's California is behind British Columbia in extreme heat. That fact alone does open, people listen to that. But on one hand, I hate to say climate change is an opportunity because it's a horrific thing that will destroy a lot of what we know and hold true and dear. But because it interlinks natural disasters that we have struggled getting sort of interest involved, it does open up a new venue for those of us who have been, the sort of responding to fires and doing that, because there's a clear nexus. We know, I mean, this is why this is happening. This is why the hills aren't full of lush vegetation, even though, 3-4 years after wildfire, they should be. It should not look like this. So it gives another opportunity to get people to listen. We just have to get through the climate delayers, and then we can move a bit more forward.
A couple of themes, if I can sum up, that I've seen. Allison, do you have anything? I'm looking at you.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add
Good.
quickly, just from the student perspective, what I can glean, particularly over the last couple of years, is that students come into law school now, I think, more overwhelmed with the injustice than perhaps they have before, right? And when you feel that overwhelmed, I think climate change, the idea of it, the concept of it, for a lot of folks, maybe not everybody, but for some of the delayers in particular, they may feel that sense of overwhelm. And so a typical human response can be to kind of detach from it, like kind of push it off in the future, kick the can. I can't think about that right now. It's too overwhelming. So I found what's helpful with students is, just as I was saying before, let's consider all sides of this issue. Let's consider all different perspectives. Let's find the ways in which comparisons can help, right? With our Coachella Valley, Coachella alignment, for instance, we found how much money folks generally spend on a meal or on water. And we priced out what it would take to, provide fresh, clean water to a household or to a mobile home development, and kind of showed that stark contrast, right? We tried to find places where we could get in or show that the perspectives might have some common ground, and also to show that a little bit here can actually have an impact. And so I think if you can continue to break down the problem, right, to show the multiple perspectives, to show the multiple impacts, but also to show that there are different ways in which we can go about resolving the issue, all of a sudden things feel a little less overwhelming. And so I think that's also something that can be done as you're thinking about strategies beyond just the traditional for solving these issues.
Just picking up on a few themes that y'all have raised. None of this happens with one person doing really, really interesting advocacy. It happens across, as you've all described, with coalition building, with coordinated community responses, with being able to raise a sense of urgency by communicating with the people who are in the field. And then, as you've all mentioned, to some extent, centering the voices of the people who are most affected, not just being the representative advocates that lawyers like to be, but to actually, and in Allison's case, UCLA in her clinic, actually her students understood that they needed to move themselves out of the way so that their clients could have a better outcome. Also, speaking to the legislator's own interest politically and economically, I've seen that in some of my own work stories I won't tell now, but actually demonstrating a dollar amount return on investment, $1 invested for $5 saved. I mean, that helps people look good. And speaking to a politician's an elected office holder's interest is an important way to do this, even if the moral concern will move them, but might maybe not move them to vote and to move it on. The difference. Thank you so much. Thank you for your wisdom and your storytelling and your great time. Thank you for everyone in this room who has held tight. I'm just going to hand my mic to Sophia and Skip. Why don't we move off the stage and we will transition here. Thank you, friends. Thank you to everyone for very important work. And now we can close out our conference with Skip and Sophia. Thank you, Allison. I'm going to take you off the big screen. Bye.
All right, we have kept you over, so we're going to keep this quick. I just want to thank everyone who has traveled here. Thank you to our little planning committee, our speakers, to our guests. Thank you for your participation, for the energy you brought to this. And we look forward to seeing you in the future in this community.
Just real quick, I'm going to steal Allison's term, overwhelmed. was a lot of information here today, and a lot of it was kind of scary stuff. And hopefully it is a little bit overwhelming, but more importantly, I'm hoping it's inspiring. There's a lot of incredibly active people in this room and online. Get involved. We need your help. This stuff is going to happen, and we really need your help in closing, as we said at the outset, the access to justice gap for the low-income communities that we all serve. And before I let you go, I just want to thank once again Pepperdine, incredible host, this gorgeous setting, and I don't know how you did it, but what an amazing day today. Thank you, Sophia, Jeff. Again, Kilpatrick Townsend for our law firm sponsor. Really appreciate it. California Community Foundation. And I need to thank Levon Anderson, who's putting this whole thing together, coordinating it. Evan Weissman for all of the tech work. Amazing job. Elizabeth Weinberg and your development team, thank you so much. And Rosina Alvarez, who has assisted us throughout this whole thing. All of our presenters, thank you. Go out and have a great day, great weekend, and then let's get back to work on Monday. Oh, Monday's a holiday, sorry. Tuesday.
Great idea. Yeah. No. Take it. Please take it. You got it, girl. Everybody.